Now I would like to ask to say something about the book. A colleague, Dr. Klaus Richter, University of Birmingham. Yeah, Dr. Richter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. When I was writing a review of Darius Stajunas and Vladimir Sigotavich's book last year, it turned out to be very positive, which is not because I actually owe very much to Darius Stajunas because he gave me very helpful advice when I was writing on my doctoral thesis, but because it is really filling these gaps that I was desperately trying to find literature and sources on when I was myself writing on anti-Semitism in Lithuania before 1914. And these gaps are so important because the history of Lithuanian Jewish cooperation is at first a very problematic and complicated history, and second, it had a very significant historical impact in the establishment of the first independent Lithuanian Republic. To start out with why it was so complicated, the Lithuanian intelligentsia of the late 19th century was regarding the Jewish population in a very difficult position because taking into account the concepts of nationalism and of nations that prevailed in East Central Europe, but not only in East Central Europe in the late 19th century, a nation required to be fully stratified, needed to have a middle class, an intelligentsia, and of course a peasantry. But the Lithuanians or the people who were supposed to become the Lithuanian nation did not have a middle class. They were basically peasants and numerically very weak intelligentsia. So it was, in fact, according to the logics of this nationalism, it was nearly impossible to integrate Jews into that. Lithuanian peasants would have to stratify, would have to become merchants, artisans, but these were the professions traditionally, and also because Russian legislation hardly allowed for anything else, these were the professions that were filled by Jews. Intelligentsia in the late 19th century was, some people grew older, some of them were replaced with people who were rather coming from a social democratic background, and the possibilities of political activism that arose with the revolution of 1905, 1906 made it conceivable that there is actually some benefit to come from such a cooperation. To make it clear how difficult it was to transgress these barriers between Jews and Lithuanians, we will have to think about how Lithuania looked like at that time. It was it didn't have the borders that it had today. It consisted of 3 governorates, one of which was the majority of which was made up of Lithuanians, but the 2 other governorates were only in the north, populated by a Lithuanian majority. And the Lithuanians were mainly living in the countryside, and the towns were mainly populated by Jews. I mean, not exclusively populated by Jews, but with a Jewish majority. And even if that was only 50 or 60%, they were concentrated in the very center of the town, so these towns did not look like the world the peasants were used to, which made a visit into these städte very distinctly alien experience to peasants from the countryside who came into the towns to sell foodstuff or lumber. And this was where nationalism set in. Nationalists said you will need to get into these towns, you will need to take over trade, you will need to make Lithuania Lithuanian, so to speak. Not in the sense that people would have to be kicked out, but they would have to be superseded. The decision makers would need to become Lithuanian, and this was a concept that prevailed up to the First World War, and even into the First World War, especially under German occupation. And this is where the historical impact comes in. That under the German occupation of Lithuania and Coronia into the land Oberost. The Lithuanians received significant support from the German occupational regime because they were supposed to become a kind of counterweight to a Polish state that would need to be established. There was no way not to establish a Polish independent state, so the best thing would be to establish a Lithuanian state as a counterweight. These plans were very much underway, but of course the whole situation changed pretty suddenly and unexpectedly with the defeat of the German Empire. So in November 1918, suddenly the whole situation was different again. And at that point of time, nobody, probably not even within the Lithuanian intelligentsia, would have thought that a Lithuanian state would arise out of this situation, a Lithuanian state that would last for more than 20 years. We had a territory that was being more or less was supposed to be vacated by a German army. At the same time, the Red Army was advancing from the east. The Polish army was trying to delineate its borders in the east. And you had a territory which was claimed by a number of Lithuanians who did not have an army, who did not have an economy, who was not at all recognized as an independent state until nearly 4 years later by most of the Western powers. So the situation looked actually very, very desperate. And this changed with a significant loss of moral support of the Polish Republic when the advance of the Polish army came along with a number of pogroms in the east. The first one in Lviv still it did not go unnoticed, but it was perceived as a kind of a very unfortunate accident that should not be repeated. But then with the massacre in Pinsk, where Jews were shot arbitrarily as allegedly Bolshevik supporters, and then with the pogrom in Vilna, there was a global public backlash on Poland, and this is where this cooperation, Lithuanian Jewish cooperation, gained strength and became a real argument in global politics, because after the pogrom in Vilna in April 1919, there was, for the first time, there was felt the need at the Paris Peace Conference to establish rights for minorities. There was actually, for the first time, the thought that there are minorities that need to be protected, because this whole region in the East is just not as homogeneous as the Western Entente would have wanted it to be. This is where Lithuania became, and pretty clumsily at first, but then pretty intelligently established itself as a kind of alternative to Poland. It was not conceived anymore, like it was for a short time after the end of the First World War, as a kind of successor state to the Lithuanian Grand Duchy. It was clear that it was supposed to be an ethnic Lithuanian state, but an ethnic Lithuanian state which was founded on these very minority right principles that were just being discussed in Paris. And this, of course, won, on the one side, a significant support by Jews, not only in Lithuania, but most importantly by Jews abroad, especially in the US, who were much more influential advocates of what was, well, let's say not much stronger advocates, but they were better organized and had a better voice, louder voice in the US than the pretty disorganized Lithuanian diaspora. So this was one of the factors that made it much more possible to make Lithuania visible on the landscape and to make Lithuania appear as the kind of state, the kind of state structure, the kind of political system that you would have to have in the East in order to cope with these problems. So I would consider that this time was the time when this very strategical, very political, and very pragmatic cooperation had its most significant historical impact. which ultimately very much contributed to the Jewry independence, to the whether it was accepted as a de jure independent country state by the US in 1922. What I found very convincing in David Stalina and Vladas Juricavic's book, because the essays made all the more important this very difficult history, how this how the situation was in 1918, and this makes it even more surprising and amazing that this cooperation and achievement of independence was actually achieved. Then what I also would like to emphasize, although this is of course, these were of course very strategic considerations, there was also cooperation on a cultural level, and this is what Morty Zaikin often emphasized, who I think is not here but also contributed to the book. So there is another level that is less strategic and less political as well, but that still needs a lot more research. Thank you very much.